This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the Antoine Dupont, Maxime Lucu, Nolan Le Garrick, and Baptiste Couillot of website builders. The world's freshest, loveliest, most exciting, easy to use website builder on the entire internet, which is the only place you find website builders. Not only can you put together a website with ease, creating a beautiful website in mere moments, but thanks to Squarespace's new storefront features, not only can you create and manage an online shop of your own products easily, with their new custom merch options, you can create your own things there and then. An entire fleet of Dupont t-shirts available for you to sell much quicker than you'd expect it to take, all thanks to Squarespace. And if you want to do exactly that, you can head to the link in the description and use the offer code SQUIDGRUGBY to save yourself some money on that shiny new website. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say France were the best team in the 2025 Men's Six Nations. They were brilliant, setting a new Six Nations record for points and tries scored, not that you're currently seeing any of them, as they pulled apart defending champions Ireland and anyone else who dared stand in their way, not that you're seeing any of this. In fact, it's probably only minorly controversial to say France have been the best overall team across the last 5 Six Nations, never finishing below second and taking as many titles as anybody else. France have built into a proper force over the last half decade under Fabien Galthié, and this year's Six Nations, which I can assure you did definitely happen despite the fact you're instead seeing footage of Serge Blanco in 1987 for legal reasons, was perhaps the moment they properly ascended to the next level. Thanks to not just the style of their victory, but the circumstance. France were, at various points throughout the championship, without, deep breath here, Romain Ntamack, Damien Penaud, Cyril Bay, Charles Olivon, Anthony Gelange, Thibaut Flamand, Gaël Ficou, Emile Gaëtan, Jonathan Danty, Nicolas Deporter, Gabon Villiers, Alexander Roma, Cameron Woki, Sekou Makalu, Georges-Henri Colombe, Poslo Tuolangi, Danny Priso, Tavita Tatafu, Leo Boudou, Romain Boras, Matthias Labelle, and Antoine Bloody Dupont through injury or suspension, and that's before even mentioning whatever the hell is going on with Mathieu Jalibert this week. Over the last 5 years, Galthié has built, arguably, in terms of raw numbers, the deepest squad Test rugby has ever seen. But at the very least, one up there with the Imperial 2010s All Blacks and modern day Springboks. France this year lost a full 23's worth of starters and yet still emerged champions of Europe. And at a lick. So, where we could dig into where they won and lost this year's championship, I think the real better question comes deeper, underneath the 5 games that took them to the title. How did France build the biggest reserve of talent World Rugby has possibly ever seen? In 2024, or as it's commonly known, last year, labellers set a new world record using an incredible 75 players over the full calendar year. For reference, the next closest side last year was South Africa on 50. And yet, despite this enormous rotation, France lost just 2 of their 12 games. The joint best win rate of any Tier 1 side in 2024 with Ireland and South Africa, though they obviously all pale in comparison to Zimbabwe, who were unbeaten all year and are therefore the best team on this earth. How did France build so much depth, so much to have 3 full 23s that can go out and win against Tier 1 teams is a reasonably simple question, but the answer has 2 very distinct components, 2 separate halves that combine to create an unstoppable blue machine, and that's what I want to get into today. 1, the incredibly smart squad building of Fabien Galthié, clearly picking up management tips from all those years he spent trying to train henchmen to kill James Bond, and 2, events that took place long before Galtier's goggles ever donned the Stade de France coaching booth. Back in the early 2010s, Cockerel Rugby wasn't exactly doing too well. In 2013, Labeler walked away from the Six Nations with a new wooden spoon to stir their ratatouille, playing arguably the worst rugby the French national team had for around 100 years. The sport had moved into a weird place in France, and I don't just mean Marseille. The national team were a joke, a distraction, but the top 14 had exploded in popularity. France's premier rugby paddling pool had always been a solidly successful league, but over the 2010s, the seeds were sown for something grander, bigger, and very quickly changing and evolving. In 2006, fresh off signing a new deal for desperate pre-Iron Man movie Marvel, comics mogul and semi-professional misconduct committee gatherer Mourad Boujroul made the stunning realization that for the money it would cost to get a team into French football's first division and keep them there, he could dominate rugby union. And so he bought his local club, Toulon, and ploughed in more cash than the game had ever seen. before. Despite being in the Pro D2 at the time, they attracted players like Tanner Umanga, Sonny Bill Williams, Jerry Collins, Dan Luger, the Armitage brothers, the promise of cash enough to overlook a potential loss of limbs. Toulon quickly built into a powerhouse as they went up the divisions. Johnny Wilkinson, George Gregan, Matt Gitto, Lee Harpenny, Marnonu, Bakis Bota, Brian Habana, very quick to turn to the pile of money dumped at their doorstep and move to the south of France. This team of assembled superstars would go on to win the Champions Cup 3 years in a row, and the Challenge Cup the year before that, making the top 14 final 5 times in 6 years, admittedly winning just one of those. They were a juggernaut, and they changed the game. One by one, more and more big business fellas started pumping their cash into rugby. The glory to investment ratio so much more favourable than professional football. However, whilst the perceived negatives of this chapter's impact are quite well discussed, the wage inflation that left the club game where it is now, including the demise of Wasps, Worcester and London Irish, as the English clubs tried to keep up with what France was doing, its role in the decline of the European Cup as it began to feel like a closed club, pay-to-play competition, killing the open-ended early noughties dream of seeing your tiny club scale Everest, and most simply, but perhaps most prominently of all, the hashtag rugby values angle. The idea the game has always clung onto that our sport wasn't like football, and therefore we shouldn't revolve all around money. How could we possibly reject the greatest force for good in the world, amateurism? Yet, the true legacy of Toulon and Mo Bougerol is less the money that brought them their first Champions Cup, but the process that led them to the second two. Toulon, the season prior to Bougerol's cat injection, were getting an average attendance of about 4,000 people. By the end of his 4th season in charge, that was up to 17,000. After his 5th year in charge, the club had grown so big, its revenue exploded so much that Bougerol stopped putting his own money in. Toulon had become a broadly self-sustaining business, thanks to that initial investment, and despite hailing from an obscure small town on the coast, became one of the best supported sports teams in France. This gave investors a model. Rugby in France has always been a southern sport. If you exclude some pockets in Paris, the sport was only ever truly popular over a thin yet very healthy belt across the bottom of the country. In fact, go back to the 2010s and the brilliant Clermont side that crushed everyone in the path providing it wasn't a final was regularly described as a northern team in rugby context, despite being close to Johnny Wilkinson's house on the southern coast and sweet Paris up north. And yet it wasn't that ridiculous when you look at the geography of teams in the top 14 the season they won their first ever Brennus, the northernmost side outside the two traditional Parisian powerhouses. Whilst that belt still to this day has the Lyon share of teams, over the years since the Toulon Revolution, that map has started to diversify much more. Rather than just pumping money into traditional teams like Toulouse, Clermont and Stade Francais, we've seen money men follow Bougerol's lead and gravitate towards 2nd and 3rd division clubs like La Rochelle, Bordeaux-Bègles, Lyon and most recently Vannes, and build those towns and cities up, Toulon style, into rugby hotbeds out of nowhere. Bordeaux has long since been a football town, yet the investment in their rugby side over the last decade has seen them grow to such a point that they've sold out every single home game so far this season in a 33,000 capacity stadium. La Rochelle as a town contains fewer people in a fully packed Twickenham, yet they sell 18,000 tickets every single week. And despite only being promoted this season, Vannes regularly fill a stadium that sits more than 1/5 of their town's population. This has built the top 14 into a proper nation-spanning phenomenon. Smart licensing, here's a top 14 bag for life I picked up in a supermarket in Nantes during the World Cup, and intelligent broadcast deals have seen the league's influence grow and grow. Canny scheduling leading to their now traditional 9 PM Sunday match, an idea that sounds insane to a British audience, on free-to-air TV becoming a major fixture and often the most watched programme on French television over a weekend. Indeed, thanks to putting so many games on free-to-air TV, last season the total TV viewership for the top 14 topped football's Ligue 1 for the first time ever. That's League 1, Ligue 1, rather than, I'm not saying vegetable. All of this has made the top 14 undeniably the best league in world rugby, and by a heck of a margin. And that's what made the step that followed Toulon's dominance so important. Of a possible 45, there were just 10 French players in the free Toulon starting 15s who conquered Europe. And with the second of those titles coinciding with France's worst Six Nations in decades, in around 100 years, something had to change. And so, the LNR, who operate the top 14 of Pro D2, introduced the JIFF laws. Not to be confused with the Jiffy law, mute your TV whenever Andrew Cotter stops for breath, these rules look to push French talent to the top of the world's best best league. Because professional rugby is generally a pyramid, everything building towards the test game, particularly the Rugby World Cup, most nations with pro clubs put limits on the number of overseas players a side can sign. For example, Irish provinces are allowed up to 4 non-Irish qualified players in the match day 23, Welsh regions up to 7 in their full squad. Japan can have up to 4 capped foreign players on the pitch at any given moment. The RFU awards money from Bill Sweeney's sock draw to Premiership sides who field an average of 15 or more English qualified players per match day 23 over the course of the season. The NCAA contributes to wages of any All Black qualified players, but not overseas signings. These rules are widespread and entirely logical. You want as many players qualified for your nation in the teams you're investing in as possible. But when coming up with laws to combat the rising number of overseas signings, instead of copying their neighbours' homework, France devised an ingenious new system. Eligibility to play for France was kind of irrelevant. In order to qualify for JIFF status, as joueurs issus de filières de formation, a player must have either played junior rugby at an FFR affiliated amateur club for at least 5 years before the age of 21, or by that age have spent a minimum of 3 years in the academy of a French professional rugby club. Each side in the top 14 Pro League and now Fédérale 1, the top 3 divisions of rugby in France, has to field at least 16 JIFF qualified players in every match day 23 and can contain no more than 13 non-JIFF qualified players across their full squads for the season. These rules allow for more loopholes than their other rivals. Ange Capeluzzo is a regular starter for Italy, yet even after winning foreign caps, qualifies as a JIFF player still thanks to spending most of his childhood in France. Guys with foreign heritage such as Attila Septar or Nicolas Martinge can go and play for Romania or Portugal without fear of their club dropping them for eating up a non-French qualified spot. And to get around the rules, it's now pretty common to see French sides raid international pathways for promising youngsters who can then become JIFF qualified for life if they spend 3 years on an Espoir squad before the age of 21. Most infamously and egregiously, Clermont Auvergne actually set up an academy in Fiji to lock future freaks of nature down as JIFF qualified without ever setting foot in France, making Clermont hence both the northmost and southmost club in the league. Whilst it's been unarguably brilliant for Tier 2 rugby, particularly other European nations, with the likes of Spain now encouraging the young players to go and join an Espoir squad and get JIFF qualified at an early age, you'd think the goal would be to have as many players eligible to go and play for the French national team the following week in the country as possible if you wanted to grow the national team's depth. And yet, the system did something even more valuable, as it forced clubs to invest in their academies. Because there was now a greatly increased chance they'd have to rely on youngsters, teams were incentivized to pump big money into their age grade systems. This was further enhanced by the FFR's new policy of not just compensating a player's current club when they're selected for French duty, but rewarding the team who developed them, whose academy they came through, with monetary credit on selection. They also loosened the loan rules, allowing young players to bounce back and forth during the season between a top 14 side who primarily developed them and a local Pro Day Duck club where there might be more opportunity for game time more easily. Because this was the other genius element. Unlike in England and especially leagues like the USA and Super Rugby where they're cut off from the second tiers, every law was applied to the whole top 3 divisions. This slowly increased the funding going into the Pro Day Duck. As to receive credits from the FFR, all they had to do was fill a certain number of French players, whilst also allowing a greater calibre of talent coming down from the top 14 to slowly raise the league up into legitimately being one of the best leagues in the world. They were also smart around loosening the laws if they needed to. A newly promoted team is allowed 1 extra non-JIFF player in their first season in the Pro Day Duck or top 14. Sides can appeal on a case-by-case basis for an extra spot as a medical joker if they need injury cover. The laws were brought up to the current level of 16 and 13 slowly, meaning the 2 divisions were never gutted of foreign talent. It all served to keep the standard of the top 14 and Pro Leader absurdly high, and therefore, when those French players make the step up, they are playing at the very, very tippity top of the club game. All of this with the level of Fédérale 1 raising year on year. The likes of Fiji captain Waisai Zalevu, Wales international Owen Williams, one cap Wallaby Tom Ross, and a significant number of Uruguay, Portugal, Romanian, Georgian internationals set to play in that 3rd division next season. All of this just allows young players coming through even more opportunity to play top quality rugby. Between 2018 and 2023, France won every edition of the Under-20s World Cup played. Their COVID-disrupted 3-in-a-row streak, a feat matched only by the Junior All Blacks between 2008 and 2011, a succession of under-20 sides that produced the core of the team that went on to win 2 World Cups and be arguably the greatest side that the game has ever seen. This is thanks in no small part to incentivising every club to invest in their academies, yet the FFR also themselves deserve an enormous amount of credit. Previously, France centralised their best talent, pulling 30-odd individual players identified from an early age as standouts into regular training camps with top caliber coaches for each age group, generally taking place in Paris or in Toulouse. In 2017, however, France changed their structure. Instead, they would draw up a list of around 160 players from every academy in the top 3 divisions and send coaches to them at the local schools, clubs, and collate them into big groups based on geographical area. It required more personnel, time, and significantly cost, but it also allowed them to reach as many prospects as possible, more than quadrupling the amount of talent they were looking at. The goal being that every youngster potentially of national interest would be able to see a specialist FFR coach once a month to track their progress. In 2021, they changed the system again. Fabien Galtier himself brought in to oversee the programme. He would be given detailed reports and clips of players who might be, one day, of national team importance, and Galtier could then be involved in selecting which of them received more dedicated treatment and even advising how they could be moulded to benefit long-term Le 15 de France. And so by the time these players reached under 20s level, not only have they spent several years working with the national team and with coaches being dropped down from there, they've also been exposed to a pretty exceptional level of rugby. Of the 23 who played the final of that 3rd straight Junior World Championship, 14 of them had already played in the top 14, with a further 3 in the Pro D2. The only exceptions who hadn't played professional rugby by the time they got there were the 4 props, understandable, props mature later than any other players, and 2 18-year-olds promoted extremely early thanks to the classic if you're good enough, you're old enough policy. By contrast, of the Irish 23 who played them in the final, only Sam Prendergast had made a single professional appearance, and that was probably at Jack Crowley's expense as well. The Irish team on that day had a combined total of 2 professional experiences in senior rugby. French scrum Baptiste Janot had 32. This isn't a purely Irish thing either. In their path to the final, just 4 of the Welsh side they faced were played in the URC, just 2 of the Kiwis in Super Rugby, and just 5 of the English in the Premiership. These players are coached extremely well from a very early age, regardless of club, with a greater geographical reach and programs such as Paris's Marseille RFC doing fantastic work, reaching demographics who traditionally didn't produce rugby players, giving a wider pool than ever before. The JIFF rules and attritional nature of the French season, which this term runs from last August until July 2028, essentially force these young players to be exposed to top quality rugby in the best league in the world, and also the top 14, as clubs have no choice but to play someone who graduated a local academy and so have to rely on these players, so invest in these players. Their under-20 setup is amongst the best in the world as well, with brilliant coaches going the extra mile, visiting players in the off-season and coaching them year round. And then once we start to reach the absolute pinnacle of their potential, Fabien Galtier comes calling and the other part of the genius approach kicks in. Last year, France broke a world record as they selected a remarkable 75 players. Yet, unlike the Lièvemont era where you could win a cap simply by asking nicely, there's a legitimate and world-beating strategy to how Fabien Galtier has built his squad. 2024 was the Gold Maestro's 5th year in blue, and in all 5, the average age of players selected by France was 26. The lowest, 25.9, and the highest, 26.8. It's a consistency in age Leonardo DiCaprio can only dream of. The balance between youth and experience always extremely deliberate, with the squad essentially evolving and evolving every single year to keep them at an optimal level. Because France broke another world record last year, handing out 22 first caps, the highest number of debuts by any Tier 1 team since the game turned professional. However, the most notable part of this is whose record they broke, because that happened to be Fabien Galtier himself back in 2020, his first year in charge, where he handed 21 players their debuts. It's a clear pattern. The first year of a World Cup cycle, Galtier casts the net wide. That first Six Nations in charge, the likes of Maxime Maydar, Rabah Slimani, and this prick were all available and playing well, yet with an eye on 2023, Galtier instead rebooted the team with players he thought would be crucial there and gift them experience. Already capped youngsters like Antoine Dupont, Roman Untermack, and Damien Penaud were given a backing, expanded roles, told, "You're the guy, go and deliver. All three of them did. Gaël Fickou was the only player included with over 50 caps, Bernard Leroux the only one over the age of 30, and it worked beautifully. France's slip-up against Scotland might have cost them the championship, but critically, both the wider rugby world and the French public fell in love with this team. After a decade of only caring about the league, the national team had reclaimed the people's imagination. 2020 was about reinvention, and 2024 exactly the same. The policy of resting big names to tour in the summer has often drawn a lot of criticism, particularly from whoever they're touring, but it's undoubtedly worked. Just as the Pro D allowed youngsters exposure to top-class rugby with less pressure on their shoulders, even if there's more pressure on their lower limbs, these tours give players a free hit, a chance to learn test rugby before big occasions. The Six Nations, World Cup and Test at the Stade de France in true typical French win your home games, away from home, who cares, c'est bon fashion are the things that matter to France, so they prioritise those, and the summer tour is a free hit. Perhaps the best recent case study can be found in the form of 20-year-old Wunderkind Ving Teo Atasogbe. Part of that first crop of teens Galtier had a hand in selecting and shaping, Atasogbe would make 2 appearances for Pau before being pulled in as part of the Under-20s World Cup winning team in 2023. That tournament propelled him into the big time, bumped up the pecking order at Pau, and soon enough nailing down a starting spot. And so, having been tracking this kid for 3 years already, Fabien Galtier called him up for that summer tour to South America last year. With the pressure off and expectations low, Atasogbe started 2 of their 3 games, scoring a try in both. He then returned to Pau filled with confidence, hungry for more, a changed player for his international experience, so much more confident. That autumn, hours before their game against Japan, professional face-haver Damien Penaud fell ill, and France were forced to promote a 19-year-old Atasogbe to their starting 15. However, having had that taste of test rugby with the pressure off in the summer, whilst visibly nervous, playing in the Stade de France for the first time ever, Atasogbe knew he could hack it at this level and was able to quickly overcome that and deliver. And so when Penaud was ruled out again for the game against Wales in the Six Nations, Atasogbe slotted in flawlessly, scored 2 tries that you're not currently watching. If France had taken a full squad to Argentina last year, Atasogbe almost definitely doesn't win a first cap there, and then isn't so confident when thrown in last minute against Japan, and likely then doesn't deliver anything like the exceptional performances he has in this year's championship, or frankly, for Pau. Yet he's just the cleanest, most accelerated example of something Médecins Non has been doing for years now. The Galtier approach to building depth is steady. Take his former position, scrum half, as one example. If we ignore the cuboid demigod who hogs most of the minutes in that position, France probably still have more depth at 9 than any other team in the world, with Maxime Lucu, Nolan Le Garrec, Baptiste Saran, Baptiste Quillot, Baptiste Janot, John the Baptist, Leo Carbonneau, and Paul Grau all competing for that 21 shirt. Yet the way Galtier has built depth under Dupont is an extremely typical example of what he's done in other positions. Maxime Lucu was handed the first cap against Georgia in 2021 before getting 5 minutes off the bench against New Zealand the following week, once the game was already won, to expose him to a higher standard of rugby and show you too part of a win over any team in the world. Lucu slowly gained experience, built himself up for appearances off the bench before finally being given a starting shirt after 8 caps off the bench on the summer tour to Japan with Antoine absent. By the time Dupont picked up an injury in 2023, Lucu had built himself up enough through the summer tours and through bench appearances that he was able to fill in expertly instantly, winning man of the match in a romp against Italy. It was a similar playbook with Nolan Le Garrec and Baptiste Quillot before him, and we might be seeing the start of this with Baptiste Janot over the next year. These summer tours have become an absolutely critical part of how France develop talent. Yes, plenty of new caps are handed out, but the real key is allowing fringe players, those in squads but unused or deployed off the bench in past campaigns, to step up. Current regular starters like Peter Mavaca, Yoram Moefana, Jonathan Dante, Jean-Baptiste Gros and Thibaut Flamand all had their careers built using this strategy. At least 7 caps, but at most 1 start before being taken on summer tour and asked to step up into that jersey listed 1 to 15. These players then, in turn, improved for their time in the summer and came back into the following campaign in the autumn better, pushing the crop rested over the summer, taking their shirt. But also, for every player who then went on and became first choice, there's a Leo Barre, Emile Gailleton, Georges-Henri Colombe, Dylan Creton, Matthias Lebel, Sekou Makalu, Dylan Creton, Danny Priso, Anton Hestoy, Demba Bamba, who may not have nailed a place in the 15 de France, but like Atasogbe recently, has shown that they can perform at the highest level when crisis presents opportunity. And because Galtier has done it so many times in the past, they know there's a clean route into that first 15, no matter who the well-established first choice. Just look at Mikel Guillard and Thiago Stogbe both awarded first caps in Argentina last year, ousting Flamand and Penaud in this year's Six Nations. Because the key here is nobody is ever discarded by Galtier. Any player he selected remains an option, his training squads sometimes reaching even 70 plus players to include them all. Where the top 14 has looked to create a league full of professional players who could play for France, Galtier's strategic selections has turned it into one full of players who can. This rotation then ground to a halt in 2023 as he condensed the number of players considerably. Only 6 new caps were handed out, the only time in his tenure that figure's been beneath 10 in a calendar year, and 4 of those were Yvan de Mortier, Paul Bourdon, Louis Bielbiere and Emily Gailleton, all players Galtier genuinely viewed as potential first choice options in that World Cup campaign coming up. We'll likely see the same in 2027. Just as Galtier's axe brought the 160-odd national interest academy players down to the 40-odd he'd focus on, the 75 used last year will likely come down to around 60 this year and next, then eventually somewhere in the mid-40s in 27, with that average age likely rising slightly as it did in 2023, where it hit the dizzying height of 26.8. France are frequently criticised for chopping and changing, slicing and dicing, for sending second teams down in the summer, but the truth is this is not only a matter of circumstances, with the top 14 final each year scheduled for one day after the apocalypse, but also an incredibly smart tactic. It's built France into a side who were not just the best team in this year's Six Nations, but one whose true next goal must be matching the only squad you could ever consider their equal, and watching those 75 players make now France's most deliberate, considered and brilliant charge for a World Cup as yet ever mounted.
Thank you for watching that. I hope you enjoyed it. It has been a while since the last video. We've had some complications, many of which you may be able to gather from some remarks in this video that led to us having to shelve some things we were working on, other things have been changed and so on, but here we are, finally got a piece together. We've got some more things coming, including if you happen to be in Swansea this weekend, before Ospreys v Lyon, I'm doing a live thing. If you want to have a look at that, tickets are on the Ospreys website, so please go and have a look there. Plus there's more stuff on the second channel, more Squid Rugby, please have a look there. We've got the podcast back, the Squid Rugby World Cup retrospective, if you fancy hearing about some old World Cup games. That's going on, and there is going to be plenty more, including another one of the kind of masterclasses we've been doing in the next couple of weeks as we're finally back, having hopefully found our way through to the other side of the, let's call them the complications that we've had over the last month. Thank you for watching, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you soon for more rugby.
Il faut me dire oui ou non. En fait, tu vois, Sébastien, il a dit non. Je vais rester en France.